Hey guys, Legendaray here, and welcome back to another Clash Royale video. And as you may or may not know, there are two big events coming up real soon in Clash Royale. First off, from July 20th to the 22nd is, of course, the Season 13 Global Tournament, where you guys have the opportunity to gain lots and lots of trade tokens, as well as some pretty cool bonus rewards as well. Secondly, from July 23rd to July 26th, we'll have the opportunity to participate in the No Tilt 20 Win Challenge. And of course, there is a big prize for those players that reach that 20 wins. Not only do you get lots of gold, but they'll also be able to qualify for the No Tilt World Championships, which is an IRL online Clash Royale tournament where the best of the best will be able to compete for some real cash prizes. So that being said, you're probably going to want to do pretty well in both of these events, and therefore today I'm going to be going over the top 5 decks to use in Clash Royale right now. All of the decks that I'm sharing today have seen lots of success in grand challenges, in top ladder, and have all made appearances in the most recent CRL season. So you can be sure that these decks do work. That being said, a lot of this is also up to the player. So make sure that you practice these decks over and over and over and develop a game plan on how to approach each matchup. Of course, deck links are down below for those of you interested. And hey, while you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this one. Also, go check me out on my Instagram and Twitter, links down below. And if you'd like to support me in game, feel free to use code Legendaray in the shop. And with all that out of the way, let's get right into the decks. Number 1, Royal Giant Cycle. Now this deck is just such a dirty deck that has just somehow managed to take this meta by storm. The Royal Giant Fisherman archetype was one that was seen quite a while ago before the Fisherman nerf, and now that the Fisherman received his buff, man, this guy is back in its glory. So this deck is a rather quick cycle deck, meaning that you're going to be rather aggressive during the entire match. Starting off, I just cycle some of my cheap cards, the skeletons, log, heal spirit, bats, and so on, and once your opponent makes a commitment in the back, then I would consider one of two things. The first thing I would consider is playing that Royal Giant opposite lane. Depending on what your opponent plays, they're probably going to be a little bit low on elixir, and this being a cycle deck, you can easily cycle back to any counters that you might need. So by playing that Royal Giant in the opposite lane, you provide a bit of an offensive outlet, forcing your opponent to spend elixir defending, meaning that they can't build up their own big push. To support that Royal Giant, well, you have some pretty obvious plays. First, you have that Fisherman. The Fisherman can pull away any unit that the opponent places to try and take out that Royal Giant. It can be so annoying when you play that Royal Giant and then play that Fisherman, and then when your opponent plays down a P.E.K.K.A. or something, the Fisherman just pulls that P.E.K.K.A. away while the Royal Giant just wreaks havoc on a tower. Other units you can use are obviously those bats as well as that heal spirit, as that heal spirit can provide a ton of healing, giving that Royal Giant just a bit of extra push to get extra shots on the tower. Now, I wouldn't normally just support a Royal Giant push with a Hunter, but I will use that Hunter if I also have a Fisherman, because the Hunter and the Fisherman just synergize so well together. The Fisherman pulls everything into that Hunter, while that Hunter just blasts everything at point blank range, dealing out tons and tons of damage. Now again, this is a fast cycle deck, meaning that you're trying to constantly apply pressure so that your opponent cannot build up the big push that they want to. But in the case that they do have a big push coming your way, well, I mean, you don't have too many options, but they are rather solid ones. First off, you have the Fisherman to pull away any big tanks, and with enough practice, you'll be able to consistently activate King Tower against a lot of different tanks. Secondly, you also have that Hunter, which can deal massive DPS as well as splash damage against any unit. So that Hunter pretty much can cover any defense when played properly, especially combined with that heal spirit that can heal pretty much half of his health. You basically have a Hunter and a half for just 5 elixir. In addition, by using smart kiting and distracting with the skeletons and the bats, you should be able to handle pretty much any defense. All in all, it's a pretty fast deck and a pretty easy deck to learn, so definitely one of the top decks that I would recommend. Number 2, Graveyard Barb Hut. Oh man, this deck, man, it just looks like a deck that is just trouble for your opponents to face. Now this deck, you can see, has got a bit of a higher average elixir cost, so starting off the match, if I don't have skeletons or the Barb Hut in hand, I'm generally waiting for the opponent to make the first move. If I do have skeletons or Barb Hut in hand, I would play those down, and that'll generally force out a move from your opponent. If your opponent really isn't making a move, splitting skeleton dragons in the back is also a perfectly fine play. But after that, you can then react to whatever your opponent plays as their first move. If they make a big commitment, then go graveyard opposite lane with a quick knight and then a quick graveyard. Or you can alternatively play a Barb Hut in the center of the map. That begins to build up barbarians, forcing your opponents to constantly spend elixir to take out those waves and waves of barbarians. Now, this deck also has a bit of spell bait in it, because with the musketeer, the skeleton dragons, and the graveyard, those are 3 cards that really require some sort of medium spell to take out. And if the opponent is using poison, well, then they're going to be really tempted to use that poison to take out the skeleton dragons and that musketeer, thus freeing you up to use that graveyard. Now on offense, most of the graveyards that I'm going to be playing are going to be off of a counter push. So after your opponent pushes in with whatever they have, you'll usually have a surviving musketeer, a surviving knight, or surviving skeleton dragons, and then you can support a graveyard with that and poison when necessary. One important note with the poison is to not be too aggressive, because the poison is a 4 elixir spell and is your only big spell, and so it's important to not overcommit and just completely waste that poison. Aside from that, on a defense, well, this deck is also really solid. The Barbarian Hut can provide any kind of major tankage from high DPS units, while the Musketeer and the Skeleton Dragons can just take everything out from afar. Aside from that, the Royal Delivery still deals out a ton of DPS with that drop damage and spawns a very valuable Royal Recruit as well. This is going to be very useful to soak up any of the charging units, such as the Princes or the Sparkies and so on and so forth. Overall, it's a rather controlling deck to play, but not too hard to pick up either. Number 3. Ice Bow. Oh man, of course, the notorious Ice Bow is going to make the list for this season. With no nerf to any of the cards in this deck this season, Ice Bow is just continuing its reign on this current meta, especially with that Ice Wizard boost as well. So this deck obviously is a quick cycle X-Bow deck, and there are 2 ways to win matches. The first way is obviously with that X-Bow, and then the second way is with the Rocket. Now, starting off this match, you're going to be cycling your cards in the back. Cycle that Log, cycle an Ice Wizard, cycle a Knight. You're just trying to make your opponents to make that move while you're just kind of beginning to build up a bit of a push. Then once your opponent begins building some kind of push in the back, I would generally go aggressive in the opposite lane with an X-Bow. This is because your opponent is going to be lower on elixir because they made that first commitment, meaning that you have a bit of an advantage when it comes to supporting that X-Bow. Now, one important note is that I generally don't like to defend that X-Bow with the Tesla immediately, because that's 10 elixir that your opponent is usually able to take out rather easily. Instead, I would just like to defend with those skeletons, that Knight, and that Ice Wizard, because that'll really speed up your cycle and allow you to cycle back to a second X-Bow. Now on the defensive end, obviously it's rather simple, right? Tesla's gonna be that main defense that can distract everything and dish out high DPS. Ice Wizard is there to slow everything down, and comboed with the NATO can honestly dish out quite a bit of damage as well. And finally, the Knight and Skeletons are down to distract, allowing the Ice Wizard and the Tesla to get as much damage in as possible. Now in certain matchups, when your X-Bow just simply can't lock on, then you can begin to resort to Rocket Cycling. Rocket Cycling is honestly quite effective in this meta, because with the defensive nature of Ice Wizard, Tornado, and the Tesla, this combination can very easily manufacture positive elixir trades that allow you to just consistently and safely rocket onto your opponent's towers. Last but not least, the Tornado is another essential unit in this deck. Not only can you use it to activate King's Tower, but there are also offensive uses that you can play on occasion, most notably to pull defensive units outside of the range of the X-Bow, giving yourself an X-Bow lock onto the arena tower. This is generally used in those last case scenarios and is a very, very high risk move to pull off. All in all, it's a very defensively natured deck, so as long as you're erring on the careful side, you're gonna do just fine. Number 4. Balloon Cycle. Now this Balloon Cycle deck, as you can see, features the same 2-card combination as the Royal Giant deck, the Fisherman and that Hunter, because as you know, the effectiveness of the Fisherman and Hunter combined is something that you simply cannot ignore. Fisherman pulls everything in, while the Hunter just blasts everything off the map. Now, starting off this deck, you can see it's a rather fast cycle deck, so cycling an Ice Golem, cycling Bats, cycling a Snowball, or cycling a Miner to the safe spot are all acceptable plays. Then, once your opponent plays an air counter in the opposite lane, pretty simple, just go in with a balloon in the opposite lane, and that generally will leave them struggling to actually defend that push. Of course, you can send in a Miner or an Ice Golem with that balloon, and also hover a Snowball in case they have anything small to try and take that balloon out. Now, the point of this deck is to chip away at your opponent's tower, because that's kind of the point of most cycle decks. But obviously, if you get a balloon connection, that's great, but in most matches that you're going to be facing, generally you're just chipping away at your opponent's tower slowly. There are multiple ways to do so. Obviously, Miner chip damage is going to be major, Snowball damage is going to be kind of significant, but the big thing you're going to really need is to get that balloon death damage. So on offense, oftentimes sending in that balloon with the Miner is going to be very, very effective, because while your opponents really struggle to make sure that balloon death damage doesn't get on tower, that Miner is just going to be chipping away at the tower the entire time. The Fisherman is also very effective in this deck, because sometimes the opponents will play down a ground unit to take out the balloon, and the Fisherman can just pull it all the way across the arena, rendering it pretty much useless. Now, like most fast decks, you're maintaining a high pressure because the goal is to make sure your opponents don't build up a big push. But again, in the case that they do, you have some very effective ways to deal with them. Fisherman for tanks, Hunter and Royal Delivery for any supporting units, and that Ice Golem is obviously there to distract. All in all, just make sure you're playing fast, playing aggressive, and you should be able to break through with that balloon or just slowly chip away at your opponent's towers. Number 5, Double Barrel Bait. Now, this deck is by far the hardest deck to play on this list, but once you do learn it, it is very, very deadly. This deck has seen so many appearances in CRL, and there's a reason. Because of its cheap cost and fast cycle, it means that the ability to outplay your opponents is very, very high. So this deck, as mentioned, is a very fast deck, so you're going to be playing rather aggressive with all of your units. Starting off, you're gonna always want to make the first play. May that be a skeleton barrel, a goblin barrel, or cycling one of your units in the back. After that, you're just gonna continue to play high pressure. Of course, this is a bait deck, so once your opponent uses one of their small spells, then you can just go ahead and pour in with the other bait units. Now, I think that point is pretty simple, but here's where the deck gets rather interesting. As you can see, this deck, on defense at least, there isn't actually too much. The Inferno Tower is gonna be very effective at taking out major tanks, of course, but you really only have the Dark Goblin and the Royal Delivery to provide a lot of that damage output for supporting units. Therefore, like all the other cycle decks I shared in this episode, you really want to try and maintain a high enough pressure so that your opponents simply cannot build up those big pushes that they want. You can do this very effectively by going with a Goblin Barrel and a Skeleton Barrel at the same time, making sure that the opponent cannot hit both of those with a single small spell. In addition, playing tricky barrels all over the place can really catch your opponents off guard, and in a high pressure situation can oftentimes steal you a win. Finally, you can also play defense with offense as well. If the opponent has a push coming in, you can play down some of your bait cards on offense to help you quicken your cycle on defense, allowing you to cycle back to a second Inferno Tower, a second Dark Goblin, and so on and so forth. All in all, this is a really fast deck that requires a lot of practice to master, but once you have, it can be a very, very deadly deck. So there we go, those are the top 5 decks to run in Clash Royale right now. I definitely recommend you guys use any of these decks when playing in that global tournament or in the 20-win challenge, as these are 5 decks that have consistently shown that they have the ability to succeed in this meta. Of course, deck links are going to be down below. Make sure you practice the deck so that you have a solid idea on how to play the deck before actually participating in the real deal. But unfortunately, guys, that's all I've got time for in today's episode. Huge thanks to all of my channel members. You guys are the absolute G's. If you enjoyed, please leave a like down below, as well as a subscription to my channel. And as always, this is Legendaray, and I'm signing off. See you guys next time.